You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. My guest today is Bonnie Rose Weaver. Bonnie is an urban farmer, community herbalist, artist, and educator in San Francisco, California. In 2014, Bonnie launched the Seed to Bottle Apothecary 1849 Medicine Garden, a project that teaches urbanites about the benefits of locally grown plant medicine. Bonnie is also author of the new book, which I have to say is very beautiful, all about plants and herbs. It's called Deeply Rooted Medicinal Plant Cultivation and Techtropolis. Welcome to the show, Bonnie Rose.
Thank you so much for having me, Jill.
It's great to talk with you. I feel like I know you after reading your book. You say in the book that you started your journey into the world of herbal medicine. It began with having asthma. And in the book, you say that you became an herbalist because you wanted to share how you felt when you healed yourself from this affliction. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So I grew up in San Francisco, and the city is definitely a place where there's just more pollution and smog and all sorts of toxins in the environment. And for whatever reason, my body is a little bit weaker in the lung area. And there's other ways to kind of approach like why I had asthma or, other types of perspectives on that. But I grew up with asthma, and I attributed a lot to growing up in the city. And I also think that in the urban environment, we're pretty disconnected from the natural environment and a lot of plants. And so when I was a kid, I used inhalers and steroids growing up, and it wasn't a comfortable experience. The feeling of not being able to breathe is pretty uncomfortable if you know anybody with asthma or if you've seen anybody with a type of a lung ailment. It's your lungs feed the body, and so I didn't really have a lot of choices because my family's option was to go to a clinic and get the Western doctor to say, I have asthma, and then that means I take an inhaler. But inhalers don't heal the lungs. They just maintain a certain level of function in need. And if you stop taking inhalers and steroids, it doesn't make your lungs stronger. You have weaker lungs if you stop taking them. I didn't know any different. And I think that a big part of my experience was that I didn't know that there were other options than inhalers. And so when I started to learn about plant medicine, I was living in the Pacific Northwest. I went to school in Olympia, and a lot of people there have gardens, and it's really easy to take a walk in the forest. And so I started becoming more familiar with plants, and eventually had friends that were interested in herbal medicine and would take tea when they got sick or use plants in different ways. At one point, I think it was for winter of 2010, I had some time, and I decided to dedicate that time to starting a garden and also researching how I could support my lungs with herbs. And so I went to the herb shop in downtown Olympia and read a bunch of books that they had available there and bought some herbs that were dried and made a tea blend for myself. And I started taking it every day. And after a month, I could feel the difference. And it was really bitter at first. It was really kind of uncomfortable just taste-wise. But I stuck with it. And then after about 3 months, I felt stronger than ever. I could do things I had never been able to do before with more endurance. I'm a pretty active person, so that means riding my bike and going on hikes and asthma triggers were less of an issue. And so I stuck with that, and I took that tea for a year, and I've never taken an inhaler since then. So from going, from being dependent on steroids and inhalers and using them in kind of like emergency situations when I'm having an asthma attack, to not even having them in my life was probably the most transformative experience that I had. And so I just kept on that train in different ways and pursued gardening more, and everything kind of started weaving together for me. So that's how my passion got started, because I was a stronger and healthier person from using plant medicine. And I thought lots of other people should probably have similar benefits if they were familiar. And I think it just goes back to how separate we are in urban environments from the natural world, and how if we can kind of piece those things together, a lot of people can live much healthier lives.
Mm-hmm. So medicine is all around us, even if we're in the heart of a city.
Definitely, yeah. And I think a lot of medicine is slowing down and taking note of what's going on in your body and how things are changing in your body and how those things change with the season. So there's so many ways that we can learn from plants. And, I have this one story of using a tea and having asthma, and that's, a story that is similar for people who get into herbal medicine. They really start to heal their body. But I think once you really start to notice, there's so many ways that we can tap into intuitive ways of knowing and healing and being, and the plants help us do that.
Mm-hmm. And integrating them more into our daily lives.
Yeah, finding those rituals and patterns, and even just, like I said, the tea was bitter, but I made myself do it every day. And if I hadn't done that, then I would never have started this pattern of tasting plants and getting to know them and all that type of learning that I did slowly.
Well, that's great. And you were so inspired by your experience. You dove into the world of herbs, and you started the 1849 medicine garden on 1/16 of an acre in San Francisco, and also a seed to bottle apothecary. Can you talk about these projects with our listeners? I just love that idea of a seed to bottle apothecary.
It was kind of just a journey that I went on. A lot of times when we're younger, we are just walking on the path and we don't totally see it. And then you can look back and kind of see where you've been and what you've made. And so that's a lot of how this project got started. I just finished college and I moved back to San Francisco when I was 22. And I was pretty confused about what I should do and what type of jobs I wanted or what I wanted to do with my time. And I got involved in urban agriculture through Little City Gardens, which was a urban farm about an acre in San Francisco that did commercial vegetable growing. And I learned a lot about just kind of like crop rotation and a little just observing, business and the way agriculture works. And they did a lot of microgreens for restaurants and flowers and all sorts of really rad stuff. And so I got involved with that, and I kept learning about herbal medicine through studying books at the library. And I also studied at Herb Farm, which is a big commercial farm in Southern Oregon that does an internship that I recommend for 10 weeks. Pretty cool.
I love their products.
Yeah. So these two things kind of came together for me, urban agriculture and herbal agriculture, a little bit of a tongue twister there. And I came back to San Francisco and I told my friends at Little City how inspired I was. And they had extra little parcel that had been their original site. They said, we're not really using it. You should go use it. And so I was given access to the backyard of an apartment building, which we measured to be about 1/16 of an acre. And that was just an oral agreement with the landlord that my friends had made a couple years back. And I just went in there and started working. And it was an incredible experience to really just start everything from seed and from just this passion and this love of plants and the herbs. There's something really powerful about growing the herbs that you use for medicine, because you really start to develop a relationship with that plant, and you start to see what it needs, and you learn about where it comes from, and you start to see how the similarities of where it grows and what it needs to grow, or how it is similar to how it works in the body. And the list goes on, and I don't think that any one person could conclude everything about one plant, but the power of being in a garden that is devoted to healing and medicine was really powerful. And so I worked on it for a few years as a hobby, and then in 2014 I decided to turn it into a business, primarily because I was growing so many plants and I didn't know what to do with them. When they came into harvest, or the peak season, I would usually tincture them, which is a preservation of the plant in alcohol generally. And so I had all these tinctures and I didn't know what to do with them. And so I started a CSA, which is the acronym for Community Supported Agriculture. And also some people call it CSH, Community Supported Herbalism. And so the phrase seed to bottle was just kind of a description of what I was doing. I was seeding chamomile and transplanting chamomile and planting it and tending it and watering it and harvesting it and tincturing it, and then eventually it would be put into a bottle. That was the emphasis and the focus of the CSA. And then I also made these little zines, which were just one piece of paper folded, so pretty simple and straightforward, about each plant, and each CSA member would receive a little zine and 1 ounce of the herb that I grew from the garden every month. And so in this way, it was somewhat of an education program because you didn't have to know anything about herbalism. A lot of the plants that I was growing were really safe, and so I would explain in the zine how to use it, how to dose it, what it might be good for, and some growing tips and historical facts. That went on for about a year and a half, but then at some point I got in touch with the landlord, and it was during the drought, and she asked me to stop gardening. So the medicine garden closed in 2015 in the fall, but afterward I was pretty upset and saddened by that loss, but I was also inspired to share the story, and that's kind of what brought me to writing Deeply Rooted. And in fact, the second half of the book is the materia medica from the garden, or the plants that we grew and their medicinal uses. And those are all the zines that I made reformatted to fit into the book. And then the first half of the book is the story of, similar to what I've been telling you. And yeah, just kind of how all that came together. So it was really just the pursuit of my passion and creativity, and one thing led to the next, and here we are.
And one thing that I got from your book, Bonnie Rose, was that you really believe that city-grown herbs are a very potent medicine. Can you tell us why you think that's true?
Within herbal medicine, it is quite uncommon, or I should say currently less common, for people to grow their own medicine. So I think part of it is the lesser known virtues of plants, because like I said, for myself, a lot of people don't know about plant medicine, they don't use it, and so herbal medicine can kind of be this obscure thing, and unfortunately it is also something that we've lost touch with. A way that I approach plant medicine is that it's a tradition that all of our ancestors practiced. And I think this is really important to remember and know when we get into herbal medicine, and to recognize that it's part of our ancestral heritage, and seeking out the plants and those practices that our ancestors used is really powerful, like in and of itself is medicine. I come to the idea that city-grown herbs are more potent because I live in a city. It's really just about using the plants from where you are. And in such a globalized world, we can get plants from anywhere. And that includes plants that are not grown with fair labor practices, plants that are, there's no international standard. So plants that are grown and used as medicines may have pesticides on them or insecticide, and using that type of practice as medicine, I don't really think makes any sense. In my mind, there's a lot of politics around herbal medicine just as much as there's politics around what we eat. I think that my experience of growing herbs is really powerful because it's really rare to see these plants growing in cities. It's really rare to meet people that know how to grow them. A lot of our ancestral knowledge has been lost, including how to germinate seeds or propagate the plants and how to grow them as best medicine. There's a lot to remember and there's a lot to maintain in these practices, and I bring my offering of that type of passion and insight to the folks that I live near, which are the urbanites of San Francisco.
Also, I think too that the plant itself is probably exposed to the same, maybe stressors that you are living in the city. And so that might make the plant able to adapt more to those. Do you think that's true too?
Oh, definitely. And that's a big part of it. So not only is it that we need to be conscious of where we're sourcing our medicine, but a plant that grows near you having the same type of environmental shifts, whether it's drought or any type of environmental shifts throughout the year, throughout its lifetime, are also ones that affect you. The fact that we live in cities and our time is rushed and stressful plants can be quite the cure for that. It's not just about the politics, but also certainly about where the plants are growing, the chemistry of the soil and the energetics, the vibration of the place and the time that you are in, where plants can really support us for living more full and balanced lives.
And one thing I think we do have to be aware of is contamination, like heavy metal contamination in certain soils. So did you always soil test before do you advocate soil testing for people before they start growing plants in the city?
Definitely, yeah. And I think that part of the reason that I chose the name 1849 for my garden is that it is about the history of the time and the place that we live in. And even though the gold rush is long gone, there's a lot of lasting impacts, and especially in cities and other urban areas where industry may have been, or other types of displacement, or really just like cultural and historical context of oppression. There's a lot in the soil, and there's a lot to be said for chemicals that may be there. Lead paint was used until 1976. And so testing that and really knowing the history of the place that you are in is a big part of what I believe this work is about, so that we can start to heal some of those cultural diseases.
And then one thing in your book that I thought was interesting was that you talked about reproducing or replicating a wild quality when we grow medicine. It's called wild simulation cultivation. Can you tell our listeners what that is?
That's a really fun concept that a lot of folks who are familiar with farming but have primarily done vegetables will need a little adjusting to, because with vegetables, a lot of the plants are pampered, and a lot of wild plants have been developed over the years, but even before genetic modification, but just figuring out how can we grow a tomato that is going to ripen earlier, or how do we make the corn taste sweeter, or how do we make, kale and broccoli are the same plant with just different developments, one in the leaf and one in the flower. We pamper our vegetables, and if you seed a flat of lettuce, they all come up within a few hours of each other, and that's because the seed and the DNA of that plant are so refined and quite specific. And that makes great food, A tender salad is much better than like a stressed out kind of old leaf weathered salad. But for medicine, one of the primary aspects that we're using is, if you look at it in a chemical perspective, is the way that the plant addresses to stress. If we are in a garden where a plant gets all the water it needs, it's never too hot, never too shady, it's going to live this really happy life. It's going to kind of be relaxed and pampered. The difference when we're growing our own medicine, which is quite similar to the way the plants are in the wild, is that they don't always have those perfect conditions. If a plant is growing in an open field, it's probably going to get too much sun in the summer, and it might not get enough water when there's drought. And the type of fertilizer will be an occasional animal that comes and leaves its offering at its roots. And so there's ways that this wild quality is desirable, but we also don't have enough of the wild to go out and take whatever we want. And that's a really common practice in herbalism called wild crafting, which should be better named wild taking. And so with city-grown herbs, which is another reason why I'm a big advocate for it, is that we're not taking, we're giving, and we're creating more life. We're creating a diverse ecosystem for the plants and animals that live in the cities with us. The quality of the plant that we're going to use for medicine can be just the same. That's the wild quality, wild cultivation technique. It's pretty simple. It's don't water your plants too much. Don't give them too much fertilizer. Stress them out, just like you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes total sense to me, actually.
But then the plants, they still have this way to survive, and they can give us that serenity and peace that we're looking for. One last thing is that the chemical level, the plant is producing more phytochemicals, so a higher increase in the plant chemistry makeup when it's stressed out in order to survive, which are the direct correlation to the chemicals that we uptake from them, if you want to look at it like that.
So the medicine could be stronger.
Exactly, yeah.
So that actually sounds great, to not have to be like a helicopter gardener where you're monitoring the plants, pampering them. It's really letting the plants grow more as they would in the wild, and then that would give you more time as a gardener too. You don't have to be out there so much.
Yeah, totally. And a lot of the herbal plants, it really depends on where you are. There's medicinal plants that grow in every bioregion. A lot of the plants that I grow are perennials too. So you're not necessarily seeding every year or, doing as much transplanting and all that kind of stuff. A lot of the plants are harvested in the second or third year, or they're a vine, or they're a woody shrub. And so unlike your vegetable garden, it's a lot less work. And you get a lot of medicine out of just one plant. So.
And then you can just sit out and enjoy your plants. And, one growing method that you stressed that I thought was really interesting was sowing in flats and not in cells. Can you tell our listeners why you think that's a good idea?
Oh, yeah. So I learned that from Peggy Schaefer, who is a great medicinal plant farmer in Petaluma, California. And basically, the cells that we use for vegetables are awesome for those really cultivated seeds. Like I was saying, they all kind of come up at the same time, but the seeds themselves have a wild quality, and so that's something we need to take into consideration. There are some medicinal seeds that do not germinate for 2 years. You put them in the soil and you have to wait multiple seasons because the seed, it's called multi-cycle germination. So the seed has to go through many cycles of temperatures, freezing. Sometimes it has to go through an animal's digestive tract. It has to, feel the heat. It has to feel the cold. And after many, many weeks or many months or even many years in some
wow.
cases, the seed decides it's safe to come out and germinate, because in the wild, there's nobody, again, pampering the soil, making it fluffy, making sure the last frost has passed. And this is just a technique to maintain the plant's life. And the plants are a lot smarter than I think we often give them credit for. And so the flats really allow that to happen. So like, for example, echinacea usually doesn't come up for 2 or 3 weeks after sowing, which is quite a lot later than, for example, like a lettuce comes up within a couple days to a week. And so if you're a new gardener for medicinals, for example, echinacea, you might think, oh, it didn't work. And you just really have to sit with it and wait. And so a lot of times I'll see some come up like 2 or 3 weeks after, and then a month after, and sometimes 2 months after, because they're not on the same clock. Nobody has been cultivating them saying, you got to come up at the same time.
So really you learn patience, I would think, from this type of...
Oh, yeah.
You either learn patience or you go nuts.
Yeah. And like I said, this is just one way of really kind of getting to know the medicine and really learning, how does this plant work? What does this plant need? And in turn, I've learned a lot about what the plant is offering as medicine because of observation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a really important piece. Sitting in the garden, meditating with the plants, watching their growth habits, and being patient is a big part of that slowing down of city life and starting to connect to our environment.
Which is one of my favorite things to do, is just sit in the garden, observe what's going on in the garden and then go within and just breathe in. It's just such a healing experience, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I would love to hear, and I'm sure listeners would too, about a couple of the plants that you grew in your garden, in the medicinal herb garden. And one plant that I thought was really interesting was Motherwort.
Uh-huh.
Could you just tell listeners a bit about that plant and how they might use it?
Motherwort is a really lovely plant. If you haven't met her, I recommend it. She's in the mint family, so a lot of really lovely, gentle plants in the mint family are used as medicine, and the Latin name is Leonurus cardiaca, which translates to lion-hearted, which is, I think, kind of speaks to how she works. A lot of people will say that Motherwort is a plant that holds you when you need a mother. And I think that there's so many times in life when we just wish that there was somebody there to hold us or to take care of us. And whether or not you've had that type of relationship with your mother, I think it's something that we all need and we all deserve. And so this plant really touches on a lot of kind of physical aspects. Like, it can work in the nervous system. It can help with PMS. It's a bitter, so it can help with digestion. But I really look at it as this like emotional holding plant that I really love in a spirit dose, which is a really low dose, usually using like 1 drop to 5 drops of the herb. And another reason that I love tinctures is because they're super portable and super easy to use. So you can just have it in your bag or in your car and have it on hand when you need it. Like if somebody hurts your feelings, or you have to go have, an emotional talk with somebody, or you just feel alone or scared, which are feelings that I think come up all the time, and we kind of don't really have a place to deal with them, or we don't have a place to put them. And I really think that everybody deserves the space for emotions and for processing what they're experiencing, and Motherwort can really help us go through that.
And I must have a very happy gopher, because I had a large Motherwort plant and the gopher ate the whole thing. It's probably feeling very blissed out. I know I'm going to get another one, but it's a beautiful plant. And and not many people have heard of it. When people would walk through the garden and say, "What's that plant?" and I'd say Motherwort, and this look of like, what? The name? What is a
What'd you
motherwort?
say about my mom?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another plant that I feel like is maligned a bit because it just spreads and grows so easily is mullein. And mullein really helped me probably
Mm,
years and years ago. I had this horrible cough and nothing would heal it. And then I was so into herbs, I got out my book. I could hardly get out of bed and made a tea with coltsfoot and mullein. And within,
mm.
I would say, hours, it just started breaking up. So could you tell us a bit about mullein?
That's awesome. Were you using the one that you were growing?
No, I think I may have sent my roommate to the store and just said, "Get me mullein and coltsfoot." And we did have an herb store at the time here, and so they got that. And the
Okay.
names are just so funny to me, coltsfoot. But anyway, it really did help, and that for me was just another affirmation of the power of plants and herbs.
Yeah, that's a great story. The reason I ask is I've
Uh-huh.
heard a lot of people say that this is something that is common, not just with. So a lot of
Hmm.
times a plant will come to you when you need it, and so I've heard a lot of people say that they were getting a bad cough or some sort of respiratory issue come up, and that mullein just started growing in their yard.
Mm.
It's a plant that you can kind of just find around and will grow. A lot of the medicinal plants like disturbed soils, so they'll grow kind of like on the roadside or in a meadow, or if there's been some sort of disturbance of the earth in any way. Even if you just go out and like weed your garden, you think you've gotten all the weeds out, but you're actually just kind of tilling the soil for
Yeah.
some other weeds to come up. And mullein will come, just kind of show herself and be present there. And it's a really incredible plant. It's biennial, so that means that in the first year it makes this little rosette or this little collection of pretty big leaves, and then in the second year generally will spike, and that's when she sends up her seed stalk or her flower stalk, which will make seed, and the flowers are really incredible. It's this plant that if you've ever met or seen or like been in a garden, it really just sticks out. And I always had so many questions like, oh, cool garden, what's that?
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Mullein, yeah. I think a really big part of, like you said, you were using it for lung support, and the leaf really looks like a lung. You can really see like there's this shape of the lung, and then it has all these branching out like the bronchi in our lungs, and so that's called the doctrine of signatures. And there's a lot of ways that you can use that to learn about plants, and it's definitely a plant that I used when I was working on my lung condition also, and it has a lot of folklore. It's been used a lot in the Americas because it travels so well, and it's from Europe, and so it goes back. I don't even know, like my great 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 grandparents were using it, I'm sure.
And that's one thing about plants that I love and medicinal plants is that the plants that we're using oftentimes were used by our ancestors, which is really a great way to connect.
Yeah, we have a lot of ancestral healing to do in our culture
Hmm.
because we live in a very like youth-oriented culture, and we have a lot of cultural and historical amnesia. And I think that every day people find a reason to remember, and herbal medicine is a really big way of remembering and connecting to our ancestors.
Hmm. And another plant that I thought was really fascinating was Grindelia or Grindelia. I don't know how to pronounce it. Gumweed. Could you talk a bit about
Yeah,
that one? Yeah.
yeah, Grindelia, gumweed. Um, I love this plant. It's so weird. It grows a lot by the ocean. Like I'll see it on the coast. I recommend if folks don't know these plants to really like find a good source. So a plant ID book or an herb book that has a picture of them and a description. It's best not to rely on the internet, but if you need that to, you can check on the internet with a reliable source. But a lot of these plants are probably growing near people, or they're in their local nursery, or if they go to a wild place, it's likely that they can be found. And so Grindelia kind of sticks out. It's a low growing shrub, and it has a yellow flower, but before it fully blooms, it has this bud that's really resinous, and is like white, resinous, and it's sticky. And so if you notice it in that phase and you touch it, it's really weird. It is another herb that has affinity to the lungs, and herb that I used again to strengthen my lungs. It's also really supportive topically for poison oak, which is another common West Coast and poison ivy condition. So that sticky resinous can help soothe the oils and the resins of the poison oak when it's blistering. So I really love Grindelia. If you could take a walk at the beach, you might find it growing there.
And there's not a lot of medicinal herbs at the beach, I wouldn't think. Well, I guess on the cliffs, right? I guess on the cliffs,
Yeah,
like rosemary
yeah.
or lavender, thyme, Mediterranean.
There's a lot of plants that are medicinal. I mean, I don't know medicine for every plant, but I've heard that, most plants have a use, whether it's a very low dose or the medicine of how it grows, and even internally. There's just so many plants that are medicinal from one culture or another that are just surrounding us, that we just have to start learning about them and then greeting them, identifying them, seeing who they are, what they offer, and that's the medicine, is that connection.
Mm-hmm. It's so true. And one of my favorite plants, which I was so happy to see that you put it in your book, was Avena sativa, Milky Oats. And that to me is the most calming tea. If I ever feel stressed out or overwhelmed, I just make a big infusion of that tea. And could you talk to our listeners about what that plant is and how you use it?
Avena sativa is the same plant that we use for oatmeal. And when we're using it in herbal medicine, there's two preparations. One is known as oat straw, which is the straw or like the stalk of the plant. And then milky oat is really the ideal form of the plant. And that's harvested when the plant is starting to mature. It makes this little pod. There's a certain point in the summer when the pod becomes milky and all of the liquids are running through the plant, and it's really starting to become its like peak maturity. And if you take the little pod from the oat and you squish it, it squishes into this little like drop or two of the sap will come out. And so that's when you know when to harvest it. And milky oat is an incredible tonic for the nervous system. It helps to realign the nerves or the myelin sheath. And so people with any type of nervous system issue or any even just stress or a chronic issue can really benefit from this herb long term. It's a tonic, which means that you can take it for its nutritive value. It's okay to take long term. It's really gentle. It's got this milky demulcent quality. It's an incredible plant, and if you're able to harvest it fresh, you can preserve that milkiness, and it makes an incredible tincture. And then if not, you can dry it, or you can use the stalk, like I said, the oat straw, and that makes a really good tea too. It's less supportive to the nervous system, but it has a lot of trace minerals in it. So a nutritive tea can be a great way to start your day. It can be a great replacement for coffee if folks are looking to get off of that, really, pack in those trace minerals in the morning and start your day off right. So just another way the plants can support our lifestyles. And another thing I love about oat is the flower essence is one of the original quote-unquote flower essences. It's hard to believe that one person invented flower essences, but the flower essence, if folks don't know, is just the vibration preserved of a plant. So it's the feeling of being with a plant, sitting near a plant, the flower of that plant preserved essentially to be used at any time of the year. And there was a guy named Dr. Bach who decided that there was few essences or a few flowers that really spoke to the human experience. And he said that wild oat was a soul alignment, and it's especially helpful for people who are searching and they're in their life and they're kind of looking for their life path, and they are trying to figure out what their purpose on this planet is, and it really helps us to start to manifest those goals. So I definitely can say from experience that the wild oat essence is very powerful.
Well, you definitely sound like you're on your life path of educating about plants. It's a good one too. Is there any other, or are there any other plants that I know you love them all like me, but are there any that you would love to share with listeners today?
One I will offer is mugwort, because mugwort is this really special plant to me. I met mugwort when I was working at the farm, Little City Gardens, and the parcel was so big that there was a large part of it that was not being cultivated, and it was still wild. And I would go back there, and it was mostly fennel, which is also an incredible plant, great for the digestive system, and really tasty. We would just let this back half of the lot be wild, and there was blackberry that grew back there, and mugwort really likes to keep her feet wet. The land was it is a creek bed that runs from the top of Twin Peaks in San Francisco out into the bay and Elias Creek. And so the creek is not always full, but when it rains hard, it's like one of the lowest points in the city. And so mugwort liked to grow there, and I would just go and sit there. And there was this really special feeling about being there, and it would be so quiet, and I could hear the city sounds kind of far away, but I would just tuck down in, and the fennel would be way over my head. And so this is kind of how I learned to really just sit with the plants, and mugwort was just like always there for me and really supportive, and it was a place that I could really feel safe and comforted. And mugwort is known for, the genus is Artemisia, named for the Greek goddess Artemis. She was a huntress and protector of women and wild animals, and just a really special kind of energy that mugwort holds, and is well known for dreaming. And so I began to get to know mugwort, and then little by little I would harvest some, and started to have a lot of healing dreams, which was a new way of working with plants and a new way of seeking healing and connection for me. I think that really kind of started to open the gateway for me in terms of not just looking at plants as like, what can they do for me, but what can I do for them? And really starting to observe how plants work in combination with each other, like the medicine of how plants grow together and the ecosystems of what they need, their families, and then like how us as humans relate to them, and that they're not just these things that like contain chemical compounds that we then ingest, but like how their beings and their vibration and their essence can like really help us transform into the people that we want to be. And so I haven't necessarily received the most like physical healing from mugwort like I have from Mullein or Grindelia with my lungs, but I've received this like personal growth and transformation of feelings and like spiritual connection and these other ways of knowing that I've really begun to like honor and nourish, which I had no connection to before. So that's how I feel about mugwort.
It's healing in a different way.
Yeah, in a way that we're not really encouraged to feel in our mainstream society. And like I said, there's not a lot of outlets there's not a lot of ways to talk about feelings or talk about spirit, or that type of connection to knowing is kind of not encouraged. And I think mugwort has helped me encourage that and really find connection in doing so.
And that gets back, I think, to your book, and you talk about field essences, which is the feeling I think that you get. And a lot of gardeners and farmers talk about this, how you can be out with the
Mm,
plants and then you just, and it's transitory in a way because it just comes over you. I think, is that what you meant when you talked about field essence?
yeah, yeah, I'm happy to hear that. It's a commonly held knowing among farmers. I'd really like to talk to more people about it, but yeah, that slowing down process and that feeling of being out, if you're in an acre of echinacea, like it's really hard to not feel your heart just so happy, and it's such a beautiful plant and flower, and it's uplifting and vibrant, and so that feeling can be, we've been talking about, a big part of healing,
Mm-hmm.
and that connection, and so yeah, I just call it's, I think it's pretty similar to a flower essence. So a flower essence is like in a bottle generally, or it's made in a field and then preserved into a bottle, and then people can feel the energy of that plant wherever they go. And then the field essence can be similar, but it's actually just the experience of being in the field. And that can be with one or two plants. That can be a plant that you have at home in a pot that you sit with and you meditate with, or it can be, your garden patch, or it could be a plant that you visit in the wild if there's a tree, or a, a field of, a plant that and you go to, and, maybe you go when you're upset, or you go when, you take your friends there and you're happy, and like you really begin to develop a relationship with whoever this plant is, and they get to know you, you get to know them. And I think that's a really important piece, and the beginning to knowing how we are in right relation with plants, and that we're not taking too much. If we really have a relationship and we know, this is what this plant looks like in drought, this is what this plant looks like in summer, this is what this plant looks like. This plant is in an abundance, so I can harvest it, or I can't harvest it because it's struggling. And so the plants kind of, in my experience, just start talking to you, and through observation, you really start to get these feelings and these knowings. Like, I know that this plant wants to be made into medicine, and that's the field essence.
And I think, science would explain it too as the phytochemicals, the essential oils that the plants are emitting, it affects us on a chemical level.
Yeah.
Like forest bathing, where you walk through the forest, and they've done studies where the essential oils of the plants and the, phytochemicals are affecting, boosting our immune system. So there's definitely multi levels of either energetic healing or healing on a biological level. I think plants definitely
Yeah.
have that potential. You were growing, and just we're getting close to the end of our time together, but how many plants were you growing on 1/16 of an acre?
Well, I had a count of about 50 at the height of the garden, and some of those plants we had a couple apple trees, and they might have just been volunteers or plants that had been growing there before I was there. And then some of them were kind of like demonstration plants, or a test to see how well a plant would grow in a certain place, or what it would need. Like, there's a lot of plants that need a lot of attention, and then there's other plants that would kind of grow themselves. And so I would have some of the plants that were really easy to grow, like oats would be a really nice cover crop, and they would really just grow themselves. And then there was, I had a year where I did like golden seal and black cohosh, which are much more difficult to cultivate, and they need a lot of specific kind of environmental needs. And so I would grow them, but not necessarily in as big of a amount as like elecampane or echinacea, which I would be harvesting for medicine. So every plant kind of had its own place, and I always said to the plants, like, you got to pay your rent. We live in the most expensive city in the world, so if a plant was kind of not doing very well, I would have to move it, or maybe decide not to continue to grow it. And then there would be plants that would just come. Like I never planted California poppy, and she would just be all over the garden in April and May and just blooming. So there's a lot, again, like the plants tell you so much about what they need, and there was a lot of learning and kind of like reconfiguring and just figuring out what would be best for everybody.
Oh, it's so great. And where can people find information about you online and about your book?
Yeah, sure. I have a website. It's 1849medicinegarden.com. So that's 1849medicinegarden.com. And then I have an Instagram, which is at 1849 spelled out. And those are the best ways. The book is available on my website, on the store, and it's also available if people are on the West Coast. I'm going to be getting a list of where people can find the book online very shortly. And so that'll be on the website too, but a lot of herb stores in the Bay Area carry it. A lot of small bookstores are carrying it too. So I'll be sure to get that up so folks can find it in person if they want to take a look at it, or they can order it directly through me.
So Bonnie Rose, we're at the end of our time together, and is there anything else you'd like to share with listeners today?
I think I usually like to end with kind of just a supportive statement, if you will, of just I know that in my experience, I came from a place that I didn't know that plants are medicine. And I am surprised every day to this day that they are so powerful. And so to encourage folks to just try, there's really not a lot at stake when we try plant medicine, but it can be a new way of knowing and experiencing the world. And it takes a lot of trust and a lot of faith and patience. Like a plant doesn't necessarily work overnight, and to just take time with the plants and notice who lives around you and who you might welcome into your apothecary for healing teas or tinctures. And so I usually end with herbs work.
They do. We both have experienced the healing qualities of herbs.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It was really fun.
It's been a pleasure chatting, and I hope many folks are inspired to seek out new plant friends.
Great. Thank you. You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening.